Hello, I'm Harold Munro, editor-in-chief at the Vancouver Sun, and joining me is Dan Fumano for our weekly chat, our City Hall columnist. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Harold.
I should say City Hall / regional columnist in the sense last week you wrote about an interesting report. The Metro Regional District hired an outside consultant to kind of look at how different municipalities have done in the region in terms of leveraging um, below market housing, I guess is one way to describe it. They use the term inclusionary housing, which
Mhm.
was new to me, from private developers when they want to, I guess, density bonus or any number of ways. But what struck you from that report? Because we know how important it is to build more affordable housing in Metro Vancouver.
Yeah, so essentially what this is, as you say, they use the term inclusionary housing. Basically, what that refers to, it's this idea of leveraging market rate residential development, real estate development to produce some kind of non-market housing, somewhat more affordable rental housing. So essentially, various cities throughout the metro region have different versions of policies where they give developers the option, if you want to build something in a given area, you're allowed to build so high, but if you want to build even bigger, you can do that with as long as they agree to reserving a certain percentage of the homes in the development will be secured at below market rates. And the sort of the precise details of these policies vary from place to place, in terms of the percentage that has to be sort of reserved at non-market, and the actual calculation of how much more affordable those are than market rates. But it is something it's relatively new. It's been developing over the last number of years in some of these Metro Vancouver municipalities. And this report that Metro Vancouver did with the help of these outside consultants, is kind of provides the first region-wide look at how these policies are actually working or not,
Right. So
in
what
terms of
struck
producing
you?
homes.
Like what
Well,
struck you in terms of how the policies are or are not working?
well, one of the things I thought was interesting was just the sort of top line number that by Metro's calculations, these policies have produced somewhere around, I think it was 9,200 non-market homes, have either been approved or completed through these policies. And that's a significant number. Like, that represents a pretty significant chunk of all of the non-market housing that's been approved or completed across the metro region in recent years. Now, it's true that, when the senior governments like BC Housing, the province's housing agency, or if the federal government, when they produce uh, social housing, non-market housing on land, publicly owned land, they're able to get deeper levels of affordability. And some of these homes are obviously for very low income people or for seniors, or so they're able to get deeper levels of affordability. But the key thing is, from the planner's points of view, is that these inclusionary housing projects, this is non-market housing that's getting produced by the private sector. So they're basically relying on private for-profit companies to produce, um, below market, more affordable housing that is secured and locked in at those rates, either for the life of the building or for several decades, 60 years or something in some cases. And so the way the Metro planner described it to me, she said, the key thing is, this is development that was going to happen anyways. These developers own this land, they're going to develop it. So it's kind of a trade-off of, is it worth letting them build a bit bigger in exchange for they produce some of that is going to be affordable housing, as opposed to having it entirely market rate housing. And of
Right.
course, in
So
addition to the
it can be a
9,200.
win-win, obviously, a win-win because the developer gets more market housing
Yes. Yeah,
and then the
exactly.
public
And
gets this housing, which and you've written enough about purely government funded housing, and that's very expensive too. Like that's millions of dollars to produce even like 100 units. But
it's it's
uh,
very
yeah,
expensive and not as fast as people would hope for governments
right,
to directly produce and supply non-market housing. Everyone kind of agrees it's a critical piece of trying to
right.
get out of this housing crisis. But you
At
know,
the
for
lower end, particularly, like as you say, at the
yeah,
lower end. Yeah.
yeah, because
Um,
at the lower end, like, yeah, that's kind of the only way. But it's just kind of seen as a crucial thing across,
hmm,
yeah, so solving the whole thing. But these non-market units, these 9,000 homes that have been produced through these kinds of policies, are seen as kind of serving median income households. So people who might have a decent income, but don't have the huge amount of money in their bank account to make a down payment to buy a new home. So this represents a lot of people, especially people who are either newer in Canada, people who are younger, people whose parents or relatives don't own property already. So
right.
there are a lot of people in Metro Vancouver who make decent incomes, but home ownership is not possible. And so this can be a chance for some other people to get a brand new home, newly built, uh, that is a bit more affordable, and so it's seen as being a positive thing. Um,
It
yeah,
seems.
and of course, as you say, it's win-win. The idea is it's win-win for the developer, because otherwise this wouldn't be happening. These developers aren't building these below market homes purely out of the goodness of their heart.
Right.
If you talk to them, they obviously do want to be contributing and helping the situation, but they're not in the business of losing money. They're not going to be building below market homes if it's going to cost them money and lose money for their shareholders and investors. So obviously, the municipal governments and their planning departments have needed to sharpen their pencils and figure out a way to make this work, that it is viable for these private sector builders to
Right.
build,
And
and
their
make these
banks,
projects
right?
actually
Their
pencil out.
lenders. Thing is, like, the
Well, of course,
developers can't do it anyways because they wouldn't be able to get the money from the banks to do it
exactly.
unless
And
they could make it work. Right.
yeah, and then nothing will happen, of course. Like, nothing's going to happen if their lenders don't underwrite the projects. So,
The
and
other
not
interesting
every
trend
municipality, sorry.
has it. Yeah, I thought there was an interesting trend in there. Is that maybe this is what you're going to get at, but the urban, what we think of as the urban core of Metro, Vancouver, Burnaby, those kind of, at least currently, like to this point, and going forward, at least for the short term, the consultants figure it's a lot easier to leverage that kind of housing than say in the suburbs like Langley or Coquitlam or Surrey.
Yeah, it's interesting. They mentioned that in the consultants' analysis, their opinion was that these policies are actually easier to leverage in the higher priced markets.
Right.
So the more central places, Burnaby, Richmond, Vancouver, where house prices are higher, rents are higher, it's actually easier to make these projects viable, including the non-market component. In some cases, as much as 20% of the project would be reserved at non-market rates. That's kind of what the city of Vancouver has been doing
Right.
in a lot of its projects going forward. But the consultants did say that even in the moderately priced areas of Metro Vancouver, these can still work, and they expect that eventually, in time, as conditions change, these kinds of things could be uh, viable everywhere. But it's just some municipalities have not pursued these kinds of policies. So,
Hmm.
the two first to pursue inclusionary housing policies were actually two of the island municipalities, Bowen Island and Richmond, um, which back in 2007. So I don't think of Bowen Island as having tons and tons of development,
Oh,
although maybe
no.
it has had more than I realized. Of course, Richmond has had a significant amount of residential development over the last, decade and a half. And then shortly after that, Vancouver and Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam, later Burnaby, New West, so others. There are some that don't have policies yet, but have indicated they want to get them. So Delta, I think the township and the city of Langley. And then there's some municipalities that do not have inclusionary housing policies, and as far as the Metro report says, have not indicated an interest in that. So that's like West Vancouver, the District of North Vancouver, White Rock, and a couple of
Surrey.
others.
What about Surrey? Because that's obviously a huge municipality. I didn't see them on the list when I looked at that report
I
as having
think,
a policy.
yeah, I think Surrey has similar, has been able to sort of produce similar outcomes, getting the private sector to build a certain amount of non-market housing through some kind of mechanisms. But I
Okay.
mean, this was one of the things that the report. So my understanding is that the idea behind a report like this, so Metro Vancouver obviously has their own planning staff, and they undertake big projects like this sometimes, because this is a big research project.
Sure.
They undertake stuff like this kind of to support the individual municipalities. Obviously, some of the smaller municipalities, there's 21 different local governments in Metro Vancouver, plus electoral area and a Treaty First Nation. You know, some of them, like the city of Vancouver, have a pretty big, well-staffed planning department. Some of the smaller municipalities don't necessarily have all those resources to be able to undertake huge research projects. So this is something Metro can do to support the individual independent, member municipalities as they sort of then go and try to figure out what housing policies they're going to want to implement. And that was one of the findings overall, was that Metro, in their analysis, they feel the report shows that these policies are working. They're producing both market housing and non-market housing without tons of direct public subsidy, right? It's producing it without giving public money the way you need for, BC housing or things like that. So actual social housing, publicly owned housing projects. So they feel like it's working, but it could also benefit. It could be more effective with a more cohesive, consistent approach across the region, right? So that's part of what they're talking about here.
Yeah, and so that if everybody kind of adopted best practices from whatever's working, and then I guess that would also work because many of these developers work across municipal boundaries. So there would be a sort of an expectation that would be consistent from municipality to municipality.
Yeah, and of course, I think there would be some level of local governments would be able to tweak the policies depending on the local context and what the infrastructure can support and what they want. But I think the idea is, yes, because of course a lot of the biggest builders don't just stick to one of Metro's 21 municipalities. They're building throughout the region, and that was kind of one of the pieces of feedback that the report noted. Was builders said it would be easier for us to do more of these kinds of projects and produce more both market and non-market housing if the policies were a bit easier, more consistently applied across the region.
Okay. Now, a lot of this happens at the rezoning stage, right? Or it does happen at the rezoning stage where a developer is able to, they can leverage their ability, the municipal ability to zone. So what's going to happen with the new provincial legislation that effectively removes some of that rezoning power from the municipalities?
So that's something the report gets into. It sort of defines these two different but related concepts. So inclusionary housing, which is what we've been talking about so far, that's been used in various ways by some, but not all, Metro Vancouver municipalities. Inclusionary housing is basically creating policies that give developers the option of doing these bigger projects if they include an affordable component. That's kind of what has been in effect in the region. Inclusionary zoning is where it's required. It's not like you give the developer the option of building bigger if they want to include affordable. It's saying anything that gets built in this zone needs to include this much percentage of affordable or non-market or whatever kind of housing. And you can build up to this size. However, this much percent needs to be. So that has never been done in BC before. Currently, BC's regulatory environment does not allow that kind of zoning. But the provincial government has indicated that it plans to introduce new legislation this year, probably in spring of 2024. So I think pretty soon, that would enable inclusionary zoning. So it would give local governments the ability to establish that kind of zoning. And Metro Vancouver, in this report, is raising the idea of doing that in these transit-oriented areas. So so the areas near transit hubs, SkyTrain stations, bus interchanges, the areas that are already well served by transit, where the province is going to be, or has been, is increasing the density, sort of not always, in some cases, against the will of local governments. So the province is increasing the density there, and Metro Vancouver, in this report, is suggesting that could be a place to apply inclusionary zoning, because if the land is going to see this increase in density, that means there's an increase in value, and inclusionary zoning can be a way to capture some of that increased value for a public good.
Right. Okay. So we'll have to wait and see what the province comes up with, because that would be that is the one fly in the ointment with the new legislation. far.
And,
Yeah.
and I spoke with the lead on the project team from the consultant that did this
Right.
report, and she's based in Ontario, but they do this kind of work across Canada. And she said there are some jurisdictions in Canada where inclusionary housing is possible, but she said nowhere has actually implemented it yet in Canada. It's used
Oh,
in some places in the United States. It's been used in U.S. markets, and they're finding, they said based on the evidence it can be very effective in producing non-market housing if the market conditions are correct. And it's a very big if. She said it really requires the conditions to work,
sure.
but it can be very effective. And she said nowhere else in Canada has actually implemented inclusionary zoning and like required this as like mandated. So that would be an interesting thing that I think housing experts across Canada would probably be looking to see what happens there.
Good. Well, we're going to watch for it too. Thanks, Dan. That was a really interesting primer on on zoning and how important it is if we're going to build ourselves towards affordability. Talk again next week. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Harold. Thank you.